Hi, I'm Dr. Maya Shetreat, and I'm sorry that I can't be there in person due to a family emergency. So instead, I am recording my presentation so that you can hear it. Beyond pathologizing, how we can best support the gifts of neurodivergence. And I come to this after 2.5 decades of working with neurodivergent people, beginning all the way when I was in medical school and doing research with children and adults with autism. And then a private practice over decades, working with children with ADD, with autism, and with really the full spectrum of neurodivergent kinds of disorders, as we call it. So I became very clear along that process that people who are neurodivergent have a very unique set of gifts. And as with all gifts, they can be a blessing or a curse. And so, I want to just touch on that as we kind of move into how best to support people who are neurodivergent, which is probably a whole lot more people than we think. So the starting point for me here is that neurodivergent people are often more sensitive. And I think in our culture, in our society, we have become, very conditioned to think that the idea of being sensitive is negative, is a disability, or is a burden, right? That does not have an upside. And I want to challenge that idea, right? Is it really a bad thing to be more sensitive? Um, Now, sensitivity itself can be a gift or a deficit. If you have um, great sensitivity, you may be able to perceive things that other people can't perceive, but you also may be subject to certain kinds of exposures, right, in your environment and otherwise, that other people might also not be as perceptive of or as injured by, right? And I think we can say that neurodivergent people, and obviously this is a very general term because neurodivergent people are actually each profoundly unique individuals, and there are kind of smaller categories of different kind of micro communities within that. So when I talk about neurodivergence, it's kind of for the sake of having a conversation and looking at the generalities, but of course we just always have to keep in mind that everybody is an individual. So the idea here is that sensitivity is potentially a gift or a deficit. And I think that really plays out in the neurodivergent community. Well, what do I mean? So there is this concept of sensory gating, and sensory gating is really the cell's windows of perception, literally, okay? From an auditory, from a visual, from other kinds of standpoints. It's measurable through evoked potentials, let's say auditory evoked potentials, visual evoked potentials. And these are actual neurologic tests with norms and, very clear kinds of measurements that people do in hospitals to support the diagnosis of things like schizophrenia or multiple sclerosis or other conditions. But that same sensory gating is actually also kind of an esoteric window of perception. It is the ability that we have to perceive reality with a wider lens, right? Let in more about reality. Many people, most people, and certainly what we'd call neurotypical people, for the most part, are experiencing a tiny fraction of reality, what we would call reality, as compared to people who are neurodivergent. It is known that people who are neurodivergent tend to have much wider sensory gating. There can be other issues, obviously, and that is what, this entire conversation and gathering is about. But within the concept of sensory gating, we know that people who have sensory integration disorder, who have ADHD, who have autism, who also have things like bipolar, schizophrenia, who also are gifted, right? And of course, we know that there's a lot of overlap between these groups. There is the twice and thrice exceptional. So, we know through data that there is broader, wider sensory gating in the neurodivergent population. In addition to that, we know that any of us can have modulation of sensory gating and that kind of sensitivity. It is not unique to people who are neurodivergent. It is just more common and more impactful, let's say. So, for example, think about hearing your name in a crowded room with a lot of noise. So, certainly you are going to perk up, right? And you're going to notice what people are saying more so, right? You're going to really tune in. That is a kind of modulating of your auditory sensory gating. Similarly, if you're a musician, you are going to hear music differently. If you have perfect pitch, you're going to hear music even more differently, right? These are all just iterations and variations of sensory gating. And so people who are neurodivergent are well known to have more acute, more profound, wider sensory gating, more ability to perceive reality, right? Than maybe other people do. Now, what this does is uh, it sometimes can stress capacity, right? And so it can make people who are neurodivergent, who are sensitive, less resilient sometimes because their capacity is stretched to the limit. And we know about capacity, right? That we need some stress. And this, is the concept of hormesis, which most of you are probably familiar with. But hormesis is really just something that would otherwise be toxic or even lethal at a higher dose, being beneficial or actually stimulatory at a lower dose, right? So something that could kill you, to put it very simply, can actually make you stronger in a much smaller dose. And that effect could be better health, stress tolerance, growth, longevity, and on and on. Now, what happens though, right? So, well, let's just say, okay, someone has these hormetic effects. And to be clear, what am I talking about with hormesis? Well, I could be talking about fasting, right? Fasting, we know, is beneficial in some amount, but in a large amount, let's say 6 months of fasting, that's starvation, right? And that can kill you. Same with sunshine, right? Some sun, very important. Uh, Too much sun poisoning, right? Sunburn, a lot of other kinds of problems that we know are associated with short and long-term problems. Same with exercise. Exercise is hormetic, right? So some is good, too much, and that varies for different people, by the way. Same with fasting, same with sun exposure, and on and on. But exercise can, if you're running a marathon, every 3 days, you're probably going to break down and, it can kill you. It could kill you. So, hormesis is important, and really understanding what is hormesis and what takes us beyond hormesis, which we'll talk about in a moment, is a really important part of this. And hormesis here, just this paper to show cells handle accumulating toxic metabolites during increased energy flux better with hormesis, right? And hormesis comes in all kinds of ways. Things I've mentioned, it could come through food, right? We talk about, phytonutrients, right? What makes grapes purple or cranberries red. And we talk about it that it's so healthy, but in fact, they are tiny poisons and they have a hormetic effect. And that is how they benefit us. So we need hormetic exposures, okay? Now, what happens if we have too big of an exposure, right? So, because our capacity really determines how well we bounce back from stressors. And, in the neurodivergent population overall, again, a generalization, but I don't think one that we would think is too controversial in this group, at least. The capacity can really vary, right? And so these stressors, when in the right amounts, which is very individual, can actually expand capacity. And so that those people can experience the sensitivity of their particular nervous system and physiology better than people who don't have that hormetic exposure. But unfortunately, neurodivergent people will experience certain events in life more profoundly because of that sensitivity. And we know that people in the same, even family, who experience the same parents and maybe abuse or what have you, or maybe not abuse, right? But one person in a family, and many of you may know this, can walk away from the experience of childhood and have felt like it was a great childhood. Another person in the very same family who may have not had very different experiences overall, right? It's not like that child was abused or picked on in a fundamental way, but their experience of the same set of circumstances can be trauma, right? And some of that has to do with that level of sensitivity and plasticity, right? So neurodivergent people can experience events as trauma. And trauma, as we know, is not what happens to us, but it's how it embeds in us. And so we know then that people who are neurodivergent are more likely to have experienced events as trauma and to have internalized these as what we call adverse childhood events, ACEs. This doesn't necessarily mean that there's some fault on the part of the parents. It just can be the experience of this particular person, this particular child. Um, and of course, we can't control that always, right? We can't control that as parents, as practitioners, as physicians, as therapists, and so on. But what happens then? Okay, the capacity is overcome. Okay, and then we start with this cell danger response. And the cell danger response is something that can happen from a physical, mental, emotional, or even spiritual sense of overwhelm on behalf of the cell. So the cell understands many, many languages. It understands all of those different categories, and then it expresses in a physical way. Okay, so cell danger response is when the cell has been overwhelmed. And what can happen, even down to a mitochondrial level, is really interesting. So I always talk about spaghetti and meatballs because I think it's really memorable. And this is actually how mitochondrial researchers talk about it. So Robert Navio, who many of you may know, is a mitochondrial metabolic researcher at the University of California in San Diego. And he is the one who coined the cell danger response term and wrote, a number of papers about it, and also is the one who introduced me to this idea of spaghetti and meatballs. We think of mitochondria, if we think of it, as being kind of like, this organelle, like it looks the same in every cell, but it turns out, no, it does not. Under stress and cell danger, mitochondria do not look the same as they do when they are functioning well. When they're functioning well, they look like spaghetti, and they look basically like these networks of long branched spaghettis, right? Spaghetti mitochondria that are in communication. They're exchanging nutrients, they're exchanging information, they're releasing waste well. When they are in danger mode, okay, and mitochondria are, of course, sentinels, sampling the environment around them all of the time. If they perceive danger, okay, physical, mental, emotional, spiritual, they will ball up into meatballs. They no longer exchange information, they no longer communicate, they no longer are getting nutrients in the same way, and they're no longer releasing waste in the same way. So the thing is that the cell will stay in this state, which is less optimal for its function, but protective, right? Meant to be protective. So, the thing is that we can't be in both growth mode and in protection mode at the same time. We are primarily in either one or the other. And that actually goes for us as an entire organism, right? As a being, and also on a cellular level, and also all the way down to a mitochondrial level. We can either be in growth or protection. So when we are in meatball mode, and we can get stuck in meatball mode. I mean, we can get stuck in cell danger until something changes it. That's the other piece here. So that is oftentimes what we are seeing in physical illness and mental illness. And, the symptoms that we're seeing in a lot of people who are neurodivergent is reflective of cells that have gotten stuck in the cell danger response. And it seems that the cells and mitochondria of people who are neurodivergent tend, because of their sensitivity, they are like antenna, and they are more likely to experience inputs, exposures, etc., whether it's toxic people, right, or toxic foods, or toxic chemicals, or lack of nature, or other things that we'll talk about, more likely to experience cell danger. And what that can look like in the brain is microglial activation, right? Where the microglia are in a 3-to-1 ratio with the neurons, okay? And when the cells are in cell danger mode, the nurse cells in a 3-to-1 ratio with the neurons, right, these microglia become mama bear. And the mama bear cells really go after, right, they start to kind of attack. Okay, and this can look like a brain on fire. And we all know a little bit about that, right? It can look like migraines, it can look like seizures, it can look like aggressive behavior, it can look like insomnia, it can look like, inability to concentrate, poor executive function, on, and on and on. And microglial dysregulation is associated with a lot of psychiatric diseases, including major depression, schizophrenia, autism, obsessive compulsive disorder, and many, many more. I mean, neurodegenerative diseases are also related to microglial dysregulation. And, we're really starting to understand that this is the cell danger response is really underlying a lot of what's happening in, what we call these pathological disease states. And here's just a list, right, of what microglial activation has been associated with. So, a really interesting turn that, I took with this was understanding that a lot of this has to do with dysregulated nitric oxide metabolism. Now, the cell danger response is happening for all of the reasons we said, but part of what then happens is that promotes the cell danger response and perpetuates it is dysregulated nitric oxide metabolism. Now, like, why is it important? Well, we have 60,000 to 100,000 miles of blood vessels collectively in our body, and health goes where blood flows, right? That is where we get circulation, we get nutrition, we get the ability to clean waste and detoxify. I mean, all of this has to do with having capillary and blood vessel dilation such that we can have blood flow to important areas of our body. And, here are just a few of the things that nitric oxide is responsible for. And some of this, from cellular signaling to reducing oxidative stress to neurotransmission to the inflammatory response, and on and on and on. So nitric oxide is very central to this. And the systems that are dependent on adequate nitric oxide are many, right? But just look at the first few: gut, microbes, immune, cognition, right? Muscular. These are the things that we are looking at in, certainly neurodivergent children and adults, and, all of the other parts of this, like, cardiovascular, hormonal, vision, sexual health, all of these things also are related. And, associated with low nitric oxide, there are a number of different symptoms. But again, what I think of as the cornerstone for neurodivergent people are things like dysregulated gut health, immune dysfunction, energy levels being depleted, poor detoxification. All of this is related to low nitric oxide. And it is possible to test for nitric oxide levels. And actually, Berkeley Life has a really great, very easy test that I like to use. So the important takeaway here is that neurodivergent people can best engage with their unique gifts when they are well supported. And well supported is multi-layer, right? This is not just eating healthy. It's not just one thing, right? It's not just taking some supplements. It's not, we know this community of people needs a complex support structure, but it is not necessarily unreasonable, right? It's just our society and our culture don't do a very good job of the things that they need, right? Because that comprehensive support has to be physical, mental, emotional, spiritual, and communal. Part of the reason for this, again, goes back to that sensitivity, right? And that sensory gating. It's understanding that, when you have this broader ability to perceive reality, then things that are vibrational and frequency actually matter in a much more profound way, an acute way, than it would for other people. For many people, and I don't think this is a strange thing to say, right? Like, we're not very in touch with our bodies. We're not very in touch with our feelings, right? We're like, kind of, a lot of people are walking around very compartmentalized, very dissociated, very disengaged, very disembodied. And that can obviously happen in the neurodivergent community just as well. But turning off the signals that are coming is much more disruptive, in an acute and profound way. So we just have to be thinking about the full spectrum of exposures, both from a nourishing standpoint and a challenge standpoint. So food, I mean, fresh food, whole foods, unprocessed foods, foods that come from healthy soil. Most of you probably know, or maybe not, that I wrote a book called The Dirt Cure. The Dirt Cure is about three things. It's about food from healthy soil. It's about getting exposed to germs and microbes, healthy germs and microbes, diverse germs and microbes, and it's about getting out into nature, right? So this is a really important part of the puzzle. And food is also vibrational. It's not just a it's not just about nutrients and compounds and calories and things like that. It's actually something even a little bit more uh, energetic at the same time, right? All of those things are important and more. Balancing microbes, same kind of issue, right? It's um, you know, we now know that our extracellular space, and this is the work of Neil Thies, a pathologist at NYU, that our extracellular space, the area around the cells, actually acts as an electrical superhighway for communication between microbes and cells, and particularly between microbes and mitochondria. And and so we're in constant conversation with our microbes. And this is actually part of the mechanism, and something I could talk about for a whole separate presentation. Part of the explanation for why our microbes are so profoundly important in our nervous system function, in our muscular function, in our cardiovascular function, in our immune function, in our hormonal function. It's because of this electrical superhighway and communication that happens in a quantum way, in fact, between microbes and mitochondria. So that's another piece, right? So food, fresh food, whole food, microbes, which can be through time in nature. It can be through having a family pet. It can be through taking probiotics, right? All of these things. Nature. So I will never shut up about nature and how important it is for a person who is neurodivergent. And this is going to vary. Again, I am not saying every person who's neurodivergent or every person is going to enjoy listening to bird song or feeling the sun on their face or, taking a walk in the woods. But there are built in for millennia, beyond millennia, mechanisms that we've evolved with as human beings to experience nervous system calm, to experience regulation, to experience all kinds of benefits through exposure to nature. So this is, right, not to say every single one of these things are vastly important. I mean, I think they are vastly important, but even some selection could play a role, and they're fundamental. They are not, right? Like, we can get very caught up in the metabolomics and the genetics and the SNPs and, get really, really granular about all of that stuff. And that's fine to do, but we also have to pull the lens back and show that there are these things that we have evolved to require and that actually nourish and regulate our physiology, our nervous systems, our spirits, our souls. And this is something profoundly important that I don't think is discussed often enough in people who are neurodivergent. Movement. Movement is profoundly important as well, right? And that can be any kind of movement. I've had the best experiences with people doing hippotherapy, right? Which is with horses. It can be dancing, it can be running, it can be any number of things. So it's just walking, right? Movement, any kind of movement. I threw in here body work because I truly, truly believe that we are missing something really important when we don't think about helping people who are neurodivergent feel comfortable in their own bodies, right? We live in a very disembodied culture. We're all very much in our heads, and a lot of what happens in the kinds of therapies and pressures to become neurotypical that I see in the neurodivergent community is trying to get them to be more disembodied. And so things like body work, whether it's craniosacral, whether it's massage, whether it's a Reiki, whether it's chiropractic, there can be any number of ways. And I don't think there's one right way. I do think it's very important to not impose something that feels unpleasant or violating to the person, right? That's, I think, the clear, right? We want them to feel comfortable in their bodies. That means they should enjoy what they are experiencing in terms of body work. Reducing toxic exposures. I know I'm not the first person here to be talking about this, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it because we have limited time, but you know, to get cells out of cell danger, we cannot be pouring toxic exposures into our bodies, right? And there are a number of things we can't control, and then there are things we might be able to control, like filtering water. If we're lucky, we can filter most of the water that we drink. Maybe even our shower water, right? We can aim for organic. We can use different kinds of cleaners in the house. Right? We can think about like how we're being turning off the Wi-Fi at night, right? Or unplugging things in dirty electricity. There's any number of ways. There's not, right? And some people can do all of the things, and some people can do only a few of the things. And it depends on a lot of things, money, bandwidth, and a lot of things, right? But considering all of that, I've had people who had terrible insomnia, turned off Wi-Fi at night, and they slept. So, toxic exposures are meaningful, and especially with cell phones around all the time. Um, just as one example, just trying out different things and seeing what you notice. Imagination. I include this because I think there's a lot of what we're not, don't let them have processed food. Don't give, don't eat whatever. Don't get exposed to. Imagination is something we should be promoting, allowing, encouraging. I think a lot of what happens in the neurodivergent community is this focus on being flawed. And from my standpoint, there's just a whole different set of gifts that people who have this different kind of sensory gating and this level of sensitivity, when well supported, that it's something to celebrate, right? Is imagination, and imagination may not be what you think imagination is. It may not be taking oil paints and a canvas. It could be who knows what. But I am always profoundly delighted, and surprised by what comes through. So thinking of what is a yes, right? What can be celebrated is a really important part of not becoming part of the toxic environment of pathologizing of people, because that is really not helpful to cultivating joy and a meaningful life. And sometimes we can be very aggressive in these medical processes, and it turns out that we've become kind of toxic, a toxic treatment, right, if we're not careful and mindful. Supplementation, I think, is important, right? So yes to all of the things I just said, and then supplementation. I do think nitric oxide support is important. I like the Berkeley Life products. I like this chewing gum for people who can do that and don't mind it. It's a great way to utilize in a kind of pleasant way the oral microbiome to help the nitrates actually be bioavailable. And, with food, obviously, we want these nitrate rich foods like beets or Swiss chard or bok choy, uh, and so on. But the thing is that you need to have them in contact with the oral microbiome for enough of a period of time that they convert to the bioavailable forms. So this actually, through gum, allows people to convert the supplement and have more bioavailable nitrates. So I love that. Other supplements, magnesium, and that could be different forms of magnesium. I'm not generally a fan of magnesium oxide, but magnesium threonate I love. I actually think magnesium citrate can be beneficial, magnesium glycinate, if they don't want to have loose stool. There's a number of options. The omega-3s I still think are very beneficial, as is B complex, as is mitochondrial support. And by that, I'm talking about carnitine, CoQ10, lipoic acid, both alpha and R lipoic acid, all beneficial, along with those B vitamins. And of course, there's much, much more we could get into. But, at a minimum, I think that every person who's experiencing negative symptoms along with neurodivergence must be on mitochondrial support in some form. And it just happens too rarely in my experience. Botanicals. So, just working with herbs. And it can be like, calming nervines like lemon balm, chamomile, passion flower, right? Those can be beneficial. It can also be, cognitive enhancing herbs like bacopa and gotu kola, right? So we have a number of botanicals. I teach a whole herbal course. Many of you probably already know about botanicals, but don't forget about that. And then things like microdosing and quantum dosing of master plants or psychedelics. I think this is something for the future, but there are people who in the autism community that have, this is something I teach, psychedelic informed practitioner program, and we have people who are teaching in the program who have autism and have found incredible benefit through microdosing and even larger doses of master plants. Quantum dosing is legal, it's vibrational, it's something that any person can do, sober, pregnant, children. I've actually had the dyad of mother and child, even nonverbal children, and both of them have dosed with quantum drops, and I've seen really profound benefit. So salugenesis is this concept. It's an ongoing, active process of building resilience, right? And thinking about health and resilience not as a passive state, but as an activity that we all are, working towards and playing towards, right? And so having a resilient terrain means having some physical, emotional, spiritual, creative, communal, ecological salugenesis, right? And again, it is an active, ongoing process beginning by getting us out of cell danger to a vulnerable state of health. Second stage, going from vulnerable health to resilient health. And third stage to vibrant health. And I love this, again, coming out of Bob Navio's work, because I love the way he talks about health, right? We can have vulnerable health, resilient health, or vibrant health. I think that's really, really important to be thinking about. And to get to vibrant health, we're not going to get there just through supplements. We're not going to get there just by knowing biochemical pathways. We're going to get there by kind of having this bigger picture and being able to kind of pull out and see where we can bring in imagination and joy and play into the picture for people, particularly children, but all people who are neurodivergent, right? And salugens are just things that promote health and something that we should all be thinking about every day. Because resilience is not just about survival, it's really about how to survive and thrive. Thank you.